Currently, it is the air regulations where most of the quote unquote battles are fought at the federal government level between those who wish to restrict oil and gas operations and those who don't. The base rule is the Clean Air Act of 1970. Look at the list of the common pollutants that the EPA sets air quality standards for. Notice, very importantly, that carbon dioxide, CO2, is not on the list. And you're going to see that particular facet has driven a lot of activities. So because it's not there, during the Obama administration, they talked about the VOCs as precursors to ozone, and these were a lot of emissions like propane, benzene, methane as well. And they wanted to try to get in to restrict these. That turned into something called the Clean Power Plan during the Obama administration. And this was a way to try to basically force states through regulatory actions to incentivize wind and solar and to a lesser extent nuclear to move away from natural gas and coal for their electricity generation. So the Trump administration was elected and took power in 2017. The implementation of the Clean Power Plan was stayed by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2017. And what that means is it says, wait a minute, there's some legal claims here that we're not acting on, but until it goes properly through all the courts, it can't be implemented. And so the Trump administration eventually repealed the Clean Power Plan in 2019 and instead put in something called the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. Well, that wasn't exactly what environmentalists wanted, so they took that to court and said the Trump administration didn't follow procedures. And in 2021, a federal court, not the U.S. Supreme Court, hadn't risen to that level yet, but a federal court vacated the ACE, saying that it was not properly regulated. And it has to do with procedural issues. And so you just see this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And on no issue, perhaps, has there been more back and forth on the question, does the EPA have the authority to regulate carbon dioxide emissions? Democratic administrations tended to say that it was implied and tried to regulate like that, or as an executive authority, tried to implement rules like that. Republican administrations tended to resist that. The issue actually went before the Supreme Court last year, and a ruling in June said, no, really, the Clean Air Act does not give the EPA a broad mandate to regulate power plant emissions. And part of the findings for that, or in the decision, the majority said if Congress would have wanted CO2 to be regulated under the Clean Air Act, it would have explicitly said so. There's no reason to do these things of, well, because of this, because of this, because of this, because of this. Well, in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in August of 2022, which was passed by 51 votes in the Senate and a very slight majority in the House, it identified CO2 as a pollutant. And so this was a direct response to the Supreme Court ruling of just 2 months earlier. How's that going to play out over time? Don't know. Stand by. But there was a lot more about the Inflation Reduction Act that had to do with environmental policy, specifically regarding climate change. And what I'm going to do is very briefly run you some of the major terms of the Inflation Reduction Act that have an effect on the topics we have discussed in the course. These things are complicated, and I spent a lot of time digging through, believe it or not, websites of law firms that were trying to explain all the implications of these. And what I got from, after much time invested in the studying, is I needed to keep my comments fairly general because there is a ton of interpretation that has to be done. So the first thing, and this is something that the oil and gas industry vehemently opposed for understandable reasons, is they have put into place, the IRA puts into place a methane emissions charge. And you can see that that charge escalates, and that turns into a pretty significant carbon tax. The Congressional Budget Office has actually estimated that it will generate about $1 billion in revenue to the federal government from this charge. I have to say, in the big scheme of life, $1 billion of charges for methane emissions doesn't sound like all that much, given how much money flows through the oil and gas industry. But the fear is, I'm sure, that right now the methane emissions charge only applies to sites that already reported their emissions. There were about 2,000 oil and gas facilities that have to report their methane emissions. That has to do with wells, pipelines, storage facilities, so lots of places that you would think that are involved in the natural gas process. I'm sure the concern is that over time, the number of sites that charge will be applied to will continue to expand, and it will bring in a lot of entities that aren't currently reporting their methane emissions. Now, there is some funding for research and development and equipment purchases to reduce methane emissions. So it's not all bad from the oil and gas perspective. There's a little bit of positive money there. We discussed methane earlier in the course and its very significant role as a greenhouse gas. The oil and gas industry is not totally blind to this, and they have been working along these lines to try to reduce the amount of flaring and the methane emissions. So there actually is a Texas Methane and Flaring Coalition. Now, this is very much a group of people in the oil and gas industry, and one could argue they're just doing this to try to push away any regulation, do just enough to make sure that they don't get regulated. But it's something that they will tell you that they have significantly reduced the number of methane emissions. There actually are positive economic incentives to reduce methane leaks because methane is natural gas. And especially now with natural gas prices so high, you can see why they're incentivized to reduce the leaks because they don't want to lose the money. I'll tell you an anecdote about this. The common perception is that the price tag to put in all of the monitoring and then do the repairs that are required to significantly reduce methane leaks is way more than you'll actually get back from the gas that you're not losing through those leaks. But I heard a couple of guys, and I believe it was from Diamondback, but I'm not sure, that were talking about they decided to do some methane monitoring of some new wells they drilled. And they said they were shocked. Their methane emissions were far more than they thought they would be. But they were also shocked at how little money it took them to spend to bring those methane emissions under control, to the point where they said, honestly, we probably recouped our investment in a year. Now, if that's true, if that's exportable, that's really good news, because that means that everybody is going to be on the same page, whether you're a regulator or an oil and gas company. Everybody's going to know that in the long run, I make more money by taking down my methane emissions. The Inflation Reduction Act also had a lot of subsidies in them. Previously in the course, I talked about subsidies for the wind industry and the solar industry. And the Inflation Reduction Act had what advocates would call $370 billion, in other words, serious money, in climate solutions. How does some of that money go? Well, we talked about the production tax credit and how that was being sunsetted. And typically what happens is when a Democratic administration is elected, it tries to extend them, and then Republican administrations don't act to extend them, and so they tend to peter off. This was a major extension. They kicked these tax credits out for at least 10 years. They have them tied into other clauses that may extend them for more than 10 years. So it raised slightly the production tax credit for facilities to 2.6 cents per kilowatt hour. And that doesn't sound like much, 2.6 cents, but if you think about it, we've learned earlier in a lot of cases, the price of power from a generator on any given day may be 2 or 3 cents. So that's actually a pretty significant subsidy. And also that 2.6 cents is indexed to inflation. Also, very importantly, they included solar facilities in the right to apply for the production tax credit. They also extended the investment tax credit of 30% for, again, 10 plus years. Offshore wind is there, solar is there, and very importantly, storage systems is there. So in the next next class, we'll be talking about battery storage systems. And now you can see having a 30% investment tax credit is going to make a pretty significant economic difference. Now, again, this is where I would love to tell you this with great specificity, but after having read all the legal websites, I'm going to say, generally speaking, projects have to choose between claiming the investment tax credit or the production tax credit. You can't claim both. And I think that's generally true, but all those lawyers are involved. It's very complicated, so I'll leave it at that. One of the new technologies we're going to talk about is carbon capture. There was a tax credit for carbon capture, but under the Inflation Reduction Act, that tax credit was substantially increased. And as we're going to learn in the next class, that makes a big difference. So that's what's happening at the federal level. If you think about it, why do businesses generally oppose regulation? Well, because it increased costs. But what you're going to find is that a lot of oil and gas operators actually favor increased regulation, even though they won't say that. And here's why. They want a level playing field. They want to do what's environmentally right, but they can't afford to do practices that put them at a significant economic disadvantage. So they like it when the regulations come out and everybody has to do it because it levels the playing field and they're not operating at a disadvantage for doing, quote unquote, the right thing environmentally. But you'll also see oftentimes a big differentiation between large oil and gas companies and the smaller oil and gas companies, and it has to do with scale. For example, under the Trump administration, the EPA rolled back some of the methane rules to a previous standard. The large oil and gas companies didn't go along with that, and the reason for that is they wanted people to view natural gas as a clean fuel for the future. And they could afford the monitoring that was required. The smaller operators, not so much. And so they were very excited about the rollback of the methane rules, which now have all been undone by the Biden administration. And also, I'll make the observation that subsidies and government R&D money can, in fact, drive innovation. And I'm a huge believer that what we need in the energy space is more innovation. And we're going to see that in our topic for the next class. But here is one of those ironies. You will hear frequently that solar and wind are the cheapest form of electricity generation. And by this point in the class, I hope you know that, yes, that is true, but that doesn't address the intermittency issue. When I say it's true, it's like true by that much. Depending on when the conditions are just right, they can, in fact, be the cheaper form of energy. And so the irony of it is, why are we passing all these major tax subsidies for sources of energy that are already the most economic? And what you know from that is they're really not the most economic, and their advocates know that, which is why they continue to push, I should say, for all of the tax incentives. So busy time with the federal government, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.